addressing US and Australian defence export control reforms. I'm Sophie Mayo, a research associate on the Foreign Policy and Defence program here at the US Studies Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia. The University of Sydney stands on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on, and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and future. As I'm sure most of you are well aware, over the past 12 to 18 months, an immense amount of work has been underway in Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom to harmonise defence trade control regimes in service of AUKUS technology cooperation. These efforts have recently culminated in the US Department of State certifying that Australia and the UK's domestic export control regimes are comparable to their own, with the exemption to come into effect on September the 1st of this year. This represents a significant step towards the creation of a defence-free trade zone between the AUKUS countries. However, reforms have been met with concern about the cost of compliance for some defence industry stakeholders, and also raised questions about what else needs to be done to ensure that defence trade harmonisation can deliver its intended effects. To unpack this issue further today, I'm joined by Dr. William Greenwalt, non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and USSC fellow Tom Corbin, who are launching a report, or have launched a report that just went live a few hours ago, which assesses progress made over the past 12 to 18 months to harmonise defence trade controls in all three AUKUS countries. The report previews a range of legacy and novel legal, political, and technical challenges at the national and trilateral levels, which continue to present barriers to AUKUS projects, and recommends further action to progress harmonisation efforts. So we're going to kick things off with a panel discussion this morning with our two authors. And towards the end of the session, I'll open up the discussion to audience questions. And just a reminder that you'll be able to submit your question at any time by typing it into the Q&A box. So without further ado, let's dive into discussion. Bill, I want to ask you first, you and Tom covered the origins and the history of the defence export control issue in your previous report, Breaking the Barriers, Reforming US Export Controls to Realise the Potential of AUKUS. But perhaps it would be useful for anyone tuning in without the same degree of familiarity to hear a shorthand of what the core issues have been with US defence trade controls up to this point with respect to allies and innovative commercial companies alike.
Sure, no, happy to do that. The U.S. export control system was developed at the height of the Cold War, and it was designed to limit arms proliferation and maintain what was at the time a significant technological advantage of the U.S. military. It addressed not only weapon systems, but knowledge behind the weapon systems. And these were all overwhelmingly military unique and actually military developed, because at the time, that was where the dollars were going. As the decades passed, the technology equation has changed. Commercial tech is now the driver of military superiority and military technology. And our allies have, frankly, grown up and become technological providers of new capability themselves. And so the system designed in the 1970s and 80s really no longer works as a way of incentivizing innovation. There are a number of issues such as the ITAR taint, in other words, the issue with disincentivizing commercial and allied participation. But one of the biggest issues, and we've been trying to do this for now about 30 years, is just the overwhelming complexity of the compliance system has impacted our allies more than anyone else, because we're actually trying to do business with those allies. And so we've been looking for, at least for the past 30 years, ways of limiting that complexity, that time, that cost, and encouraging greater cooperation with not just Canada, which we've always had an exemption with, but with the UK and Australia.
Thanks very much, Bill. And Tom, turning to you, to set the scene in tangible terms, perhaps you can give us a quick rundown of what's happening in the AUKUS space with respect to tech transfer and cooperation, particularly for Pillar 2 of AUKUS. We've seen a fair bit of recent activity in that space, even in the absence of defence trade control reform.
Thanks, Sophie, and a quick thanks to Bill for joining us for the webinar today. It's really great to get to discuss these issues in a public forum. So maybe just to provide a quick scene setter with respect to AUKUS and defence technology sharing. You're right. I think we have actually seen a fair amount of progress under Pillar 2, but a lot of that actually depends on how you view Pillar 2 and what it's actually intended to achieve, at least in the short term, particularly against Pillar 1, which, as we all know, won't actually really deliver tangible capabilities for Australia until the next decade. So maybe just to kick things off, I mean, we've obviously had the refreshed nuclear propulsion tech sharing agreement that was announced last week, albeit with some hazy language around political agreements. I won't go into that here. On Pillar 2, Sophie, you and I actually covered this in a piece for The Strategist a few months ago, where we basically tried to unpack Pillar 2's PR problem. And as well as what you might consider to be its legitimate outputs in the absence of harmonisation on things like defence export control reform. The PR problem there we kind of unpacked was that because so much of what is happening in the Pillar 2 space is happening behind closed doors, i.e. in the classified environment, and because, quite frankly, there were some inflated expectations amongst the policy community as to what it could actually achieve in the short term without the harmonisation of things like defence export control reform, people would look at Pillar 2 and the absence of a shiny trilaterally developed capability like a hypersonic missile and kind of make the judgment that Pillar 2 isn't working. Whereas if you reconceptualize Pillar 2 and think of it both as a way to get after defense, innovation, and military technological challenges within the three countries in a more coordinated way, if not in a collaborative way. But if you also conceptualize of Pillar 2, as I think the Australian government has here for some time, as a bit of a scalpel to get after some well-known and long-standing regulatory challenges to defence co-production, co-innovation, and co-imagination, then it's actually doing okay. The defence export control harmonisation issue, which we're speaking about today, is it's one direct output of Pillar 2 in a way. But there have also been some activities happening in the trilateral space where the three countries are essentially trying to maximize the efficiencies of those advanced capabilities they already have. So I've seen a couple of exercises with unmanned vehicles using new AI algorithms and kind of focused on data sharing. I think we're also about to see in the very near future the use of a new AI algorithm on board the three countries' P8 maritime patrol aircraft. Then there's also been some progress in the AUKUS adjacent space for Australia under something that Bill and I referred to in our last report as Pillar 3. So if you look at Australia's guided weapons and explosive ordnance program, for example, that has, in my view, now effectively become an alliance initiative. Even if it's still tagged as an Australian national enterprise, there is enough US input there and enough reliance on US tech transfer to mean that this really is an alliance initiative, and therefore alliance technology sharing practices are implicated there.
And sticking with you, Tom, could you give us a quick summary of what happened with the export control debate in the US over the last 12 months or so since your last report? And, what were the main arguments, who made them, and how do we end up in this position that we're in today?
Sure. So here's where we really get into the defense trade control issue that we're really here to talk about. When Bill and I published Breaking the Barriers back in May 2023, the debate in the United States regarding ITAR reform for Australia and the UK was only really starting to heat up in the public setting. I think in a nutshell, I can capture that discussion around that issue and basically divide it into two camps, or, two poles of advocacy for what those changes should look like. So on the one hand, you had those who argued that Australia was already sufficiently comparable to US export controls. They included folks from the Australian government, Australian industry, but also quite a few prominent Republicans in Congress, and some quietly in the Biden administration, is my understanding. I think those sentiments were quite clearly reflected in the text of the Koala and the Brits Acts, which were submitted in the House in mid-2023, and the Torpedo Act in the Senate, which was proposed shortly after, which essentially recognized Australia and the UK as already comparable and proposed quite sweeping carve-outs from US export controls as a product of that. And just quickly on that, I think the leading proponents of this view also kind of had two sub-points which are quite important. The first was that they pointed out that the threats of industrial espionage to the United States, to Australia and the UK, they're not unique to Australia and the UK. And that Washington was actually confronting a crisis of its own on this front. And the second point would be that these proponents essentially frame demands that Australia and the UK should enhance their regulatory comparability, as it were, as kind of jurisdictional or territorial overreach. On the other hand, you had a group who argued that any export control reform in the United States would require kind of corresponding reforms to Australian and UK processes. So the people who were prosecuting that argument included people from the State Department, prominent Democrats in Congress, and quite a few elements of the incumbent administration. The argument there was basically that to secure AUKUS defense trade, i.e. to secure US technologies, that wouldn't be possible without reforms to Australian and UK regulations to better mirror what the US had. So by doing so, that effectively equated this idea of an AUKUS platinum defense trade standard with US regulations. And these did not necessarily have to be the same thing, but I think that's kind of where we've ended up. The way that debate washed up, in shorthand, you can go and read the nitty-gritty details of that in the report. But basically, while stakeholders across the US system agreed that reforms to US trade controls were essential to the success of AUKUS, it washed out that the majority view among key constituents was that doing so would only be possible were Australia and the UK to better emulate those same regulations themselves.
Great, thanks, Tom. So Bill, turning back to you, a lot of the discussion that Tom has just sketched out has hinged around this term comparable, but it's not always been clear as to what exactly that term means. So I was hoping you could tell us what that term actually means, what are its origins, and how has the term been historically interpreted?
Sure. Comparability is in the eye of the beholder, I guess, but it actually has met a very interesting history. So you have to go back almost 30 years ago. And the Clinton administration was attempting to do exactly what we're seeing being done in AUKUS, which was to provide an exemption to licensing for the UK and Australia. And this created all sorts of an interesting interagency battle in the Clinton administration. And frankly, the Department of Defense won. And President Clinton made a determination to go forward and do this. And immediately what happened is the State Department ran to the Hill and undermined that. And there were a number of things that were going on right around this time, particularly in the Republican side of the House. Concerns about the Hughes-Lorrell case, concerns about the Canadian ITAR exemption being manipulated, and the Chinese and the Iranians manipulating that exemption to their benefit. And this created this backlash, and essentially that was the first time that any progress with the now AUKUS allies was put down. So what ended up being put into statute was a poison pill. It was designed to ensure that no ally of the United States would ever be able to have an exemption like the Canadians. And of course, the Canadian exemption was also whittled down as well. And the poison pill provision on this would be that a country would have to have a comparable export control system to the United States. And the interpretation by at least the advocates for this language was that would mean identical. All right. And identical would create so many issues and pretty much provide the entire innovation system of a country and give it over to the US State Department that no one would ever want to try to pursue this path, or at least that was the thought. I worked for a different member of Congress, Senator John Warner, And the key thing for him was this term was never defined. Comparability was not defined as exact. It was not defined as the same system. There was should have been flexibility, and in his view and the view of the Senate Armed Service Committee at the time was that this language could go forward because it was flexible enough when the time was right, and so on. But the debate that has occurred over AUKUS over the last 12 to 18 months has been about exactitude or a more relative comparability that achieves the same effect. And for a while there, we weren't sure which one was going to win on that.
Great. I'll just pause for a second to remind people to submit questions through the chat function as we keep going. So Bill, sticking with you and turning back to current day, could you walk us through what has and hasn't changed with US export controls and unpack what the FY 2024 National Defense Authorization Act directed the US government to do? And since that time, what have different departments done?
Sure. The 24 NDA essentially states that upon the determination by the State Department of that our allies have a comparable, or the US or the UK or the Australia has a comparable export control system, a license exemption for a number of various transfers of technology can take place. So essentially, they were locking in a Canadian-like ITAR exemption in statute, but linked it back to this tainted word of comparability. And so, it was touch and go whether their comparability determination would be made. It was made right as our report was going to print. And so that has been made, and therefore then there will be a linkage to an ITAR license exemption relatively soon.
Very interesting. Okay, thanks, Bill. Turning back
So
to you, Tom.
what I actually should ask the other part of that. What has changed on this? Essentially, nothing has changed with the ITAR. What this will lead to is a process which will allow the way the ITAR is interpreted, that won't change, but the paperwork behind implementation of the ITAR with the US, UK, and Australia will change. And I think that's the significant change that we're talking about, is not a change in the how ITAR or what ITAR is, but how it will be implemented between our closest allies.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So turning back to you, Tom, could I get you to quickly summarize the reforms that Australia has just made to its own defence trade control laws? And what are the major changes, that the government's made in the interest of achieving this idea of comparability?
Sure. So maybe before I do that, I think it's probably a good moment to point out just how the discussion around this issue kind of has evolved since we published our first report in May 2023. I think back then, the question was very much what changes would be required in the United States to facilitate AUKUS. That discussion has now well and truly broadened out from kind of unilateral national reforms to broader questions of harmonization. And as I think we'll discuss later, I think there are some pretty significant consequences of that beyond the defense trade control discussion itself. But to focus on the changes that were made in Australia, essentially, there were two acts that were introduced in the latter stages of 2023 and kind of refined and passed through the Australian Parliament in 2024. In the report, Bill and I only focus on the updates to the Defence Trade Control Act, but there was, of course, also the 2024 Safeguarding Australia's Military Secrets Act, and those two things were meant to kind of go together as part of the common jigsaw. To summarize what the changes that were made were essentially the creation of 3 new offences in Australian defence export control law and an exemption clause for the UK and the US to mirror those that Australia was going to receive from those two countries. The offences basically, you can summarise them as a deemed export offence. So the supply of a defence and strategic good list, so DSGL technology, to a non-exempt foreign person within Australia. There's also a resupply offence. the supply of goods and technology on part one, which is the munitions part, and part two, which is the dual use part, sensitive and very sensitive lists of the DSGL that were previously exported or supplied from Australia, so an extraterritorial element, and a services offence for military goods and technologies. Broadly speaking, these amendments were intended to address major concerns held by US proponents of comparability along the stricter guidelines that Bill has just outlined regarding the issue of deemed exports. I think in our engagements with US counterparts, deemed exports was the thing that came up the most as a point of concern, which is essentially the provision of a foreign origin defense good or service to a third-party foreign national, whether it's in Australia or another country. Obviously, the reciprocal licensing exemptions are intended to develop license-free trade or a license-free defense trade zone between the AUKUS countries, which would ideally foster greater trilateral innovation and collaboration and streamline defense trade. I mean, needless to say, I think these reforms have generated more questions than answers for many stakeholders across the Australian ecosystem in particular, including kind of stoking anxieties that were kind of latent here about whether Australia was effectively adopting the ITAR by responding to US requests to action certain regulatory reforms. I think my own judgment here is like the simple answer is not quite, but the longer question, which will come down, I think, a lot to the way these are implemented, is let's wait and see. So on the one hand, I don't think it's actually all that new a concept for Australia to emulate aspects of US regulation in the defense trade control space. We've used US regulations as a standard against which to craft Australia's own regulations in the first place. It's not a novel concept. And it's not really the subject of dispute between the country's two major political parties either. I think it's worth pointing out. But I mean, at the same time, I think stakeholders here are still worried that the nature of the reforms that have been enacted this time and the lingering questions that remain over what exactly the effects of those will be, you can kind of, there are lots of them, but in the report, we more or less identify two that we think are quite prescient. So there's this question of whether Australia has effectively adopted its own version of the ITAR taint. I think that discussion is yet to be resolved, and I think a lot of it will come down to implementation. But like that concern really stems from the creation of this extraterritorial dimension to Australian regulations for defence and certain dual-use goods. And as Bill has outlined earlier, this is the very thing that has deterred US allies and innovative companies from working with the Pentagon in the past. The Australian government said that it's going to sunset the reach of the extraterritorial aspect of Australia's regulations, but then that raises quite complex questions, I think, about how Australian regulations will interface with US regulations over the longer run, especially when there is no sunset to the US ITAR. And if we're talking about co-developed capabilities and basically the expiration of one set of regulatory controls, I think there are open questions over who will ultimately control that technology and that capability. Then the other main point that I think stakeholders here have been a little bit confused about is what are the consequences of cohabiting defense items and dual-use commercial items on the same regulatory list. So in the United States, defense items are captured under the ITAR and dual-use and commercial items are captured under the export administration regulations, which are governed by the Department of Commerce. But here, everything's going to be governed by the Department of Defense. And so I think Australian stakeholders, they're waiting to see exactly how these regulations will be administered. I think the government's indicated that it will administer the first and the second part of the DSGL in different ways, but the proof will be in the pudding, really.
Right. So a question for both of you. I want to invite both of you to weigh in on what the reforms will and won't allow Australia, the UK, and the US to do together, noting that you spoke widely with stakeholders from across the Australian and US ecosystems. So I'm wondering what are the big takeaways from all of this? What are the benefits? What are the challenges? And what, if any, are the unanswered questions that you have about where this all might be headed? So Bill, we'll go to you first.
Okay, so let's start with comparability. It was adjudicated in two different ways, and I think the implications of that are going to be very interesting. So first of all, it was adjudicated, or maybe that's because the way the Australian government decided to approach how to deal with this, more along a criteria of exactitude. So therefore, what Tom's talking about as far as creating the own Australian taint is because of that adoption of exactitude of U.S. Export control regimes in their own. Interesting enough, when we didn't cover this in the report, but now that we're seeing what has been adjudicated, so to speak, and sent up to Capitol Hill, is the UK did not pursue a policy of exactitude. They pursued a policy of achieving the same goal with their export control system as the United States. So therefore, there are now this very interesting different dynamic that has occurred. And how that plays out will be very interesting. The next thing is I think because of where we are and where the US is on this, this is primarily a Canadian ITAR exemption. It's primarily US focused. It will make it easier for strictly US transfers. And it basically is a paperwork reduction act for the UK and Australia. In other words, but as long as they keep their own kit and their own knowledge out of it. All right. So therefore, the transfer of US technology, the use of US technology, the co-production of strictly US technology with no UK or no Australian knowledge, that's the win on here. All right. Where there is, where the devil becomes in the details is the future is, well, what happens when Australia or the UK bring their own technology and their own knowledge into co-production and co-development? And unfortunately, since there's been nothing done about the way the ITAR is implemented, therefore, more than likely, they will lose their use of that technology and that knowledge to the US State Department, the US government. And therefore, that is a huge disincentive to co-production or co-development. Co-production of US systems, probably a great thing and can continue and will go on. But co-development and bringing in all those new unique companies in autonomy and AI and quantum, that is going to be a tough sell and probably won't happen. And that's the essence of Pillar 2 is still right now a pipe dream until that is changed. The other issue is the ETL. There are so many exemptions in the ETL. It's pretty much puts us back. Again, this is the deal of 1999, and Australia and the UK finally got that deal. But as we know, 25 years have passed, and some very interesting new technology issues and capabilities have arisen since then. So because of that, Pillar 1, because of the ETL, Pillar 1 is going to be difficult to do. It's not going to be as easy as we thought. And Pillar 2, except for those unique military technologies with unique military contractors, it will be impossible to execute. And I think that's just where we are at the present time. A lot of progress has been made, but that is a real issue. And then finally, as Tom was saying, the whole issue of how Australia's new taint is going to play out is extremely interesting, because that does close a lot of doors and destroys a lot of potential innovation out there if it adopts the US system. And we have to recognize the UK did not adopt this system. The UK did not put a taint into their system. So that is something for us to just the least to put out there and understand. Tom, what'd I miss?
I think you covered all the big fish there, Bill. Maybe just to riff off the ETL point, and the kind of the integration, the co-production point. I think that the 70 to 80% of defense trade that is going to be eligible for license-free movement between Australia and the United States, which are the two countries we're primarily interested in here, that's going to have some pretty significant benefits for things like federated maintenance, repair, and overhaul of US assets in Australia, potentially for co-production of legacy systems, including things that are proven and have real deterrent effects in the near term. So just to be clear, there are benefits to this for Australia. But as Bill was saying, the scope of the ETL And the lack of clarity around exactly, how some of these regulations will function in practice really does mean, I think, that there is a risk that we may end up, at least in the first instance, with a defense trade control arrangement that is AUKUS by country. That is, it features Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, but it's not necessarily AUKUS by technology when it comes to Pillar 2, at least in the first instance. As Bill was saying, a lot of the items on the ETL fall into categories like hypersonics and unmanned systems, which are, of course, priority items for collaboration under Pillar 2. I think the rationale that I've heard used for the inclusion of these technologies on that list is because it's important for the three countries to protect the advantages that they have vis-a-vis China, Russia, and other competitors around the world. That's not necessarily a bad argument. But if you consider that one of the core rationales of AUKUS Pillar 2 in the first place was not just to stay ahead in these capability areas, but to catch up, particularly in areas like hypersonics, then there's a lot of work that's still remaining to be done to make sure that we're developing capabilities at the speed of relevance in those areas in ways that incentivize companies producing technologies that don't reside within the Pentagon or within the defense exclusive ecosystem to work with the three countries to get after that problem. I think one of the other things that's worth pointing out, it's quite a remote risk, but I still think history is quite indicative here, is that there is a heightened political risk if there is a major or serious breach with respect to industrial security now. I think history would suggest that the heightened premium with respect to comparability from the United States vis-a-vis Australian defence trade controls might introduce a new degree of political risk and the potential for tangible costs for Australia in the event of a major breach. And that's because, effectively, the functioning of the so-called AUKUS Defence Free Trade Zone is premised on State Department sign-off, really. It's not simply a hypothetical risk, right? Like Canada's experience in the 1990s is quite instructive. Again, we outlined this in the report, but Bill's referred to this a few times, not just in this presentation, but in previous talks. The risks are real there. Even if the strategic circumstances have greatly changed since then, and the cost for the United States of suspending the agreement between the AUKUS countries would be far outweighed by the benefits, like the risk is still there, and I don't think it's something that we can ignore. And then the last thing I think is that there's going to be a real challenge in the Australian ecosystem when it comes to export control literacy and compliance capacity. These were both already major barriers for Australian companies wanting to work in the defence space before these new reforms were passed. Now it may be the case that even if there are more companies whose technologies will be implicated by these regulatory structures, including those who may not want to participate in defense projects, they are still going to have to skill up on how exactly to navigate this new complex regulatory environment. There's a bit of a lack of an understanding or lack of resources, particularly in the small and medium-sized enterprise community here in Australia, that the risk there is that this could disincentivize them from working with the AUKUS countries on AUKUS projects. And as Bill says, if Pillar 2 in particular continues to focus on innovation squarely within the government defense space or the defense explicit industrial space, then we're really not maximizing the potential of AUKUS here.
Bill, turning to you, in the report, you and Tom list a combination of unilateral and trilateral requirements, which you think are going to be necessary to maximize the benefits of these reforms or to bed down trilateral harmonization efforts to date. Would you be able to take us through a few of those?
Well, I think I'll take you through the biggest one because I think it's the most important. And that is the AUKUS nations face an incredible threat out there and need to bring their scientific and engineering talent together and work together on new technologies that frankly are being driven for the most part in the commercial marketplace. If we do not address the US ITAR taint, if we do not address now and nip it in the bud the Australian ITAR taint, which is going to emerge, this will not happen. And we will become a technological island. And all of that new quantum work and all that new AI work will be done in the commercial marketplace and will be available to our adversaries and allies alike. But it won't be available to the US Defense Department or possibly the Australian Defense Department because of the barriers that are being put in place. Those barriers have to be addressed. This was a great first step, and it's going to eliminate a lot of bureaucracy. But now we need to focus squarely on how can we do co-development. And doing co-development is going to mean changes to the underlying export control system. So that's number one. Obviously, there's a lot of other things that we need to do. There are issues on just capacity both in Australia and the UK on dealing with this. A lot of questions that we're trying to get answers for that industry had is how is FMS going to work in this? How do existing sales work in this? Lots and lots of questions that the governments need to start addressing. But that's backwards looking. We have to be forwards looking. And if we don't address these barriers to Pillar 2 and co-development, AUKUS will essentially be a nice to have, but it won't really achieve the objectives that we were looking for. Tom, you probably have a few more to add to that.
I think those are the big ones, Bill. Maybe just to loop back to something I said in some of my opening remarks. I really do feel like this defense trade controls harmonization saga is kind of the case study or the first step in a broader suite of trilateral alignment or harmonization efforts that are probably going to result from this. In fact, it's not as if these discussions aren't happening in other areas like intellectual property sharing arrangements, procurement, budgeting, what have you, security clearances and other things. But now that we've kind of had this first initial big fish regulatory alignment effort, I think we're going to start to see some pretty surgical efforts in other areas. And I guess given the focus on industrial security issues, particularly from the US side vis-a-vis Australia, I wouldn't be surprised if something like cybersecurity standards are the next step here or the next case study. Particularly when you consider the new CMMC regulations, CMMC 2.0, are due to come into effect in the United States next year, and Australia and the UK are already engaging the United States on these issues. Whether or not that becomes kind of another trilateral level on top of that for companies or entities working on AUKUS projects remain to be seen. But I really do feel like that's where we're going. And in that sense, it's probably worth thinking about whether AUKUS needs some kind of industrial security working group or industrial security function between the three governments that gets after these in a bit more of an organized or coordinated manner. I mean, to be fair, I think the three governments have done quite well in the absence of that to go back and forth on these reforms and to get after them in what is both a very short and a very long space of time, depending on how long you want to look at this whole defense integration conversation. But in terms of getting after this in a more organized fashion and arguably a more equitable fashion going forward, I think there's going to be a real need to create some kind of trilateral platform upon which to get after that sort of thing.
Great, thanks, Tom. Turning to some audience questions, we had some pre-submitted questions. Bill, there was a question about the UK's defence trade control changes. I know that this isn't touched upon as much in the report. Wondering what your view is on their changes and how you think UK industry will be impacted in comparison to Australian industry.
So I think there were a few issues with how US tech is treated within the UK industrial trusted community. And the UK has addressed those. There's going to be, I would say, a few more procedural hoops that they've agreed to in that. But I think they were mostly successful in showing that their current controls, their Official Secrets Act, the way they control their technology is sufficiently comparable to the U.S. to gain the comparability determination. So what does that mean from a what the UK is probably going to end up doing? Well, the UK is probably going to take this, and whenever they have U.S. technology, they're going to essentially hermetically seal it and keep it away from their technology, because they don't want to lose the right to move forward and either export that or make additional changes to that. So I think that they have, they see because they were so adamant about not accepting an ITAR taint into their own system. I think they have a better understanding of what those type of accepting those type of restrictions would do to their innovation system. And so because of that, I think the UK will probably have a two-tier innovation system, an AUKUS system, which will be, again, very US centric, and a UK innovation system, and never twain shall meet until we figure out a way of fixing and how to determine how to bring in UK and Australian technology into US systems, or co-developed systems. So I think that's really the key. The UK kept their options open. They kept their options to be an exporter of defense. They kept their options to be their own creator of defense tech, and the ability to work with other countries and incentivize working with other countries, because their export control system is not going to be a barrier to working with the French or the Germans or the other Europeans or even the Canadians.
And Bill, sticking with you for a second, we've got a question from Jennifer Thompson, who asks, what has the view been about AUKUS amongst congressional proponents of Buy American policy within the Department of Defense?
Boy, that's a really interesting question. And so the Buy American link to export controls has always been separate, okay? Although many congressional staff, I think, understand that export controls can be used to a great degree as a barrier to keep foreign technology and foreign capabilities out. And so, so far, what I've been kind of amazed by we'll talk about the export controls, and then we'll talk about Buy America quickly. So export controls has always been a Republican concern about opening up export controls. And as Tom mentioned earlier, that's kind of flipped. And the greatest advocates of moving on greater export control reform has been the Republican ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee. That's a flip in politics. On Buy America, you've always seen Republicans and Democrats, supporting it in practice, but the idea is there hasn't been a push to do anything more on that. With the Republicans, to a certain degree, standing up for more free trade in the past. That era is gone. And so how the politics of this may intermingle in the future is very interesting. Right now, they've been kept separate. Buy America is one thing, export controls are another, and particularly export controls with our closest allies. If they ever get commingled, it will be an issue. And hopefully we won't see that. And there are good reasons not to commingle those issues.
Tom, turning to you, Lauren Alexander from McGraw-Nicol Advisory has a question. How do you see the US elections impacting the future of AUKUS export control reform?
Oh, that is a multifaceted question. How much more time do we have? 15. Look, I'm sure Bill will have thoughts on that. And maybe just to add something quickly onto what Bill said before I dive into the election question. I think the export control and the Buy America issues are kind of already intersecting with the kind of broader federated defense industrial patchwork that the United States is trying to build in the Indo-Pacific with partners like Australia and Japan. Let's focus on the guided weapons issue as kind of an example. So recently, the United States and Japan have been in talks about Japan increasing its production capacity for Patriot interceptors, for example. And there is an extent to which Japan can increase its production, but that is also contingent on the United States' ability to produce a certain number of items that go into those interceptors, the technology for which it has not shared with the Japanese yet. So it's more or less kind of an example of how even if there's a federation to some extent of some of the componentry that goes into the items that the United States and its allies in Asia are going to use or may use in the event of a conflict, export control limitations on sharing the more sensitive technological aspects of those things are going to mean that production capacity in one country is only going to mean as much as production capacity in another country. So really the circle has not been closed. In the Australia case, I think that is something we're going to encounter in the coming years. If you look at the OSMIN statement from a couple of weeks ago and the really evident and welcome progress that was articulated on Australia's guided weapons and explosive ordnance enterprise in terms of moving from co-assembly of munitions to co-production in the near future, it's more or less going to be the same story unless we have access to the kind of the high value technological components that go into those. And again, just to rehash the point, production capacity in Australia is only going to mean as much as production capacity in the United States for those respective components. On the election piece, it's kind of hard to tell. I have no reason to suspect that any of this would be wound back by either administration. And though some effort has been made recently to kind of put a degree of separation between the Trump campaign and Project 2025, if you go and read some of the recommendations for the Department of Commerce that have been issued by authors under that project, they essentially advocate winding back some of the privileges that have been extended to the United States close allies, including Canada, Australia, and the UK. So whether or not that gets adopted in a Trump policy platform, again, like a lot of this depends on the president who is around him. There are risks there, but I wouldn't necessarily expect those to come to fruition unless there is some high profile reason, particularly if it's high profile in terms of media coverage, that would give the president, the potential president, and his advisors reason to look at that in any more detail.
Great, thanks, Tom. Bill, turning to you, and perhaps Tom, you might want to weigh in on this one as well. Matthew Brown from the US Air Force asks, is it politically feasible to expand AUKUS to include Canada, Japan, or NATO allies, excuse me, in an AUKUS Plus or AUKUS Plus Plus formation?
That it makes perfect sense, national security sense, but it doesn't make sense until we can solve these real nitty-gritty issues of how to work together. If not, what we're going to have is a kind of a nice place to meet and maybe have some good dinners and good wine, but we're not necessarily going to be producing any new capability. We have to solve this problem with our closest allies first and come up with a template that can be used for, say, Japan, say for some of our allies who in NATO, like the Norwegians or the Dutch, who have similar type of systems and have a lot of technology to offer and are working closely with the US, not only in intelligence matters, but in industrial base matters. So I think it's a step-by-step process, but first we have to solve this ITAR problem. If we don't solve it, it's meaningless to bring a bunch of, you'll see right through it. You got to have something real here. And the only way you can have real capability is for us to work together. And I think as an alliance, yeah, there should be a larger NATO, Japan, Korea, industrial capability of the democracies, but you need a template, and the only way to solve that is through the hard work and of what's going on right now. And we've made some progress, but we have a lot more to go before, we should be looking to add Japan or someone else. Tom?
Yeah, I don't think the politics are the problem, really. I don't think the strategic case is the problem either. It's as Bill says, it's how this functions technically and in practice. On a very basic level, you can imagine were Japan or a South Korea to be brought into an AUKUS Pillar 2 project at this stage, there is a chance that if the project was entirely classified and if it was between the three AUKUS governments plus the government of Japan, that some kind of project specific arrangement could be created to at least get something moving. But if not, then you'd effectively have a defense technology partnership with two tiers of export control licensing exemptions. So on the one hand, you'd have the AUKUS countries, which are in a tier above, and then you'd have Japan or whoever else, whichever other country is participating, kind of in a bracket below that. So until that's worked out, like, I think it's an open question as to whether, the likes of Japan, South Korea, Canada, what have you, want to press ahead with that sort of collaboration at an early stage so that they have a seat at the table, as it were, to talk about how these agreements might work in practice, or whether it's in their best interest to sit back for a little bit and wait for the AUKUS countries to, figure out how this works. And I think as we've sketched out, the defense trade control picture in the AUKUS context it's become a little bit more complex rather than simpler, I think. So, if I was sitting in Tokyo or if I was sitting in Seoul or Ottawa, like, I'll be looking at this pretty closely before proceeding.
Great, thank you. So a question for both of you from Paul Madison, who asks, how does the Australian extraterritoriality requirement impact on universities' global collaborative defence-related or potential dual-use technologies research?
Tom, I'm not exactly sure how they impacted the extraterritorial impacted on universities. Do you have that answer?
I mean, a real kind of nitty-gritty focus on how universities were implicated by these changes and, definitions around basic and fundamental research and what have you. They were kind of outside the scope of what this report was focusing on. My understanding in the Australian setting was that the government and the university sector managed to land on a definition of fundamental research that was basically agreeable between all the different stakeholders. And I'm in no position to offer legal advice on defense trade controls. But to kind of go back to what I said before, I feel like a lot of this really is going to rely on implementation. I think if you look at the history of the way that US defense trade control debates have unfolded and the way in which those regulations have applied, a lot of it really does come down to the implementer and the culture of implementation in the government departments which are responsible for this sort of thing. I imagine, Paul, I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer to your question, but so much of this is kind of at a point where we just have to wait and see how this pans out.
But I think that the question of extraterritoriality is a huge one and a huge risk that Australia is taking on. And I could, so outside of the university construct, in the private sector construct, the concern about commercial companies or foreign companies who do business in Australia getting their technology tainted by Australian bureaucracy may be such a disincentive that they will essentially do one of two things. The first is just not do business. The second is to bring in their kind of second-class technology and allow you guys to taint that. And that's not really getting you where I think you want. But that's exactly what's happening in the United States.
Yeah, and just quickly on the Australian regulations, the government has insisted from the get-go that this is designed to be a permissive system. That will be great. But historically, defense trade controls have not been designed to be permissive. They've been designed for the exact opposite purpose. So it does require this kind of like cultural and mindset shift to how this body of regulations functions with other strategic imperatives to actually facilitate collaboration at the speed of it.
Great, thanks, Tom. So Bill, turning back to you, and actually, perhaps I'll ask both of you to comment on this. We've got a question from Zoran from Thales Australia, who asks, how will the three nations decide whose jurisdiction to apply solutions developed with a significant amount of know-how from all three?
That is the question. And we don't know. Okay. And because the underlying US ITAR system has not been changed, the expectation of that would be that you would lose your technology and the ITAR taint would apply. And all the incentives for doing ITAR free that companies have pursued in Europe and elsewhere will still apply, but they'll apply not getting something tainted in the AUKUS context. I think those negotiations have to start, and they have to start now, because that's truly the question. This is pretty much, the deal is coming from a US-centric focus. It's coming from a 1980s mentality that the US dominated all military technology, and anything good that came in the military sector came from America. And then we had to control it. And anything that our allies provided was just on the periphery, and obviously they would want us to control it. That world is gone. That world has seen, it's no longer relevant to where we are, but it's the law of the land, okay? And so those discussions have to happen. What happens when Australia has something really good and they want to bring it in? And they do have lots of technology that's really good and should be brought in to the construct to support all three nations. Well, it's hugely uncertain where that's going to go, and those discussions have to start immediately. So, I guess everyone can have a great party that we've got an ITAR exemption, but the reality is the work starts now on answering that question, because that is the critical question to the success of AUKUS, and I don't think we have an answer to it yet.
Thanks, Bill. Tom, turning to you, we've got a question about the Australian context. Christopher Skinner from the Nuclear Propulsion Roadmap for Australia asks, how will Australia overcome restraint on setting up co-production of US material in Australia, for example, Anduril's Ghost Shark?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. And I think something that, at least in the State Department's initial rule on this, was kind of left unaddressed. There were some fairly obvious restrictions on the sharing of technical data for the purposes of co-production or setting up manufacturing in foreign countries. I'm not sure Ghost Shark is the best example here, because it kind of has been developed kind of in a bubble away from ITAR for basically its entire life cycle. Like Anduril came to Australia, set up shop here with an Australian affiliate, worked exclusively with the Australian Navy and the Australian government without seeking kind of US government or US company involvement, kind of actively resisting that, until they had a proven advanced capability that I think today we've seen some reports from Anduril itself that the first prototype of Ghost Shark has just been shipped back to the United States. I'm not sure for what purpose, whether it's a further co-development or kind of co-innovation enterprise, but it's interesting to me that has developed. The manufacturing piece of this is going to be critical when it comes to not just componentry that goes into the submarines, but if we're going to manufacture Pillar 2 capabilities at scale, and we're going to manufacture some of them in Australia, then addressing those questions is going to be pretty top of the list, in my opinion. Now, you could make the case that the United Kingdom and the United States have, X amount more of industrial capacity than Australia could ever have to produce those capabilities. But that would kind of ignore the very salient argument, at least among the kind of the policy and strategic thinking community, that there is an inherent strategic value in having that production capacity in Australia in the event that there is a contingency here. Like, you only have to look at the number of days that it takes for a US ship to sail from the west coast of the United States to Asia, and it's a matter of weeks. And in a conflict, you're not going to have that amount of time. And that's part of the appeal for Australia to the United States in that co-manufacturing context. But unless we can get that right with ITAR reform and with kind of the whole other suite of industrial security requirements that are going to come along with that for co-production purposes, then there's still a little way to go there.
Thanks, Tom. With that, I will draw our discussion this morning to a close. I want to thank you both for your outstanding and novel contributions to this very wicked problem set. And given the work yet to be done that you've discussed this morning, it seems that there may be scope for a follow-up report, so we might be sitting here again in a year's time. I also want to thank the audience for tuning in. Would encourage all of you to read this report. As I mentioned, it went live this morning on USSC's website. Thanks again. We look forward to seeing you again at future USSC events.